The oak-paneled courtroom of Manhattan's Supreme Court was suffocatingly silent. Chloe Hastings adjusted her designer skirt, a triumphant smirk playing on her lips as she glanced across the aisle. She had done it. She had stolen the billionaire husband, orchestrated the perfect high-profile divorce, and was moments away from claiming a vast real estate empire. Opposite her sat Catherine, the soon-to-be ex-wife, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. To everyone in the gallery, Catherine looked utterly broken. But as the defense attorney slowly stood up, unclasped his leather briefcase, and pulled out a single, heavily notarized document, Chloe's perfect world was about to violently shatter. The air inside courtroom 302 was thick with the kind of tension that only accompanied the dismantling of a dynasty. Outside the heavy wooden doors, the New York press corps was buzzing like a hive of angry hornets, desperate for any leaked detail regarding the dissolution of Richard and Catherine Sterling's 25-year marriage. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a masterclass in suffocating formality. At the petitioner's table sat Richard Sterling, a 52-year-old real estate magnate whose tailored Armani suit could not entirely hide the nervous sweat beading at his temples. Next to him, conspicuously absent from the official legal filings but aggressively present in the flesh, was Chloe Hastings. At 28, Chloe was a striking vision of calculated innocence. She wore a modest, cream-colored dress that suggested quiet elegance, though the 10-carat diamond glinting maliciously on her right hand told a vastly different story. Chloe felt a thrilling rush of adrenaline. She let her knees subtly brush against Richard's under the table, offering a comforting, proprietary pressure. She had won. Over the past 3 years, she had meticulously evolved from Richard's junior executive assistant to his indispensable confidant, and finally to the sole object of his midlife obsession. She had convinced him that his wife Catherine was a cold, unfeeling relic of his past who didn't appreciate his genius. Slowly, systematically, she had persuaded Richard to siphon funds, transfer titles of luxury properties into hidden LLCs, and drain their joint accounts, leaving the marital estate looking like a barren wasteland. Across the aisle at the respondents' table sat Catherine Sterling. If she was devastated by the betrayal, her posture gave nothing away. Dressed in a sharply structured charcoal blazer, her silver-flecked hair pulled back into a severe chignon, Catherine looked less like a scorned woman and more like an executive preparing for a hostile takeover. She hadn't shed a single tear since the day Richard awkwardly confessed to the affair in the foyer of the Hamptons estate. Bags already packed, Chloe waiting in the idling Mercedes outside. Catherine had merely nodded, locked the door behind him, and immediately dialed Arthur Penhaligon, the most ruthless family law attorney on the eastern seaboard. But as far as Chloe and Richard were concerned, Arthur Penhaligon's reputation was practically irrelevant today. Richard's own attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named David Rosenthal, had spent the last 6 months aggressively moving the goalposts. Rosenthal had buried Catherine's legal team in endless discovery motions, falsified corporate losses, and offshore banking obfuscations. "They have nothing," Chloe whispered into Richard's ear, leaning in close enough for the gallery to witness the intimacy. Rosenthal said the financials are locked airtight. She's going to walk away with a fraction of the penthouse and maybe the upstate cabin. Richard gave a stiff nod, his eyes fixed on Judge Harrison Miller, who was currently flipping through a mountain of manila folders. "Just keep quiet, Chloe. Let David do the talking. Once the judge signs off on the preliminary asset division, the Cayman accounts mature, and we're free." Chloe leaned back, her smirk returning. She allowed herself to daydream about the renovations she had planned for the Sterling flagship penthouse on Central Park West. She was already mentally discarding Catherine's antique French tapestries in favor of minimalist, modern art. She imagined the society galas, the philanthropic board seats that would inevitably be hers once the dust settled and the ink dried. Catherine would fade into obscurity, a tragic cautionary tale of a wife who aged out of her usefulness, while Chloe would ascend to her rightful place as the reigning queen of Manhattan real estate. "All right, counselors," Judge Miller's voice boomed, startling the room to attention. He adjusted his reading glasses, peering over the brim at the opposing tables. "I have reviewed Mr. Rosenthal's submitted financial affidavits regarding the dissolution of Sterling Holdings' joint assets. According to these documents, the marital estate has suffered catastrophic market losses over the last 24 months, leaving a net distributable value of a mere $12 million. A hushed gasp rippled through the gallery. $12 million was a staggering sum to the average person. But for Richard and Catherine Sterling, whose combined net worth had been publicly estimated at close to $900 million just 2 years prior, it was a laughable insult. It was clear as day to anyone paying attention Richard had hidden the empire. Chloe bit the inside of her cheek to stop herself from grinning outright. $12 million to split. Catherine would get $6 million. Pocket change. "Your Honor," David Rosenthal stood, buttoning his suit jacket with a theatrical sigh of regret. "It is a tragic reality of the current commercial real estate market. My client, Mr. Sterling, has absorbed devastating blows to his portfolio. We are prepared to offer Mrs. Sterling a generous 60% of the remaining liquid assets, in the spirit of an amicable separation." Judge Miller frowned, his eyes narrowing. 60% of $12 million. After a 25-year marriage where the respondent was listed as a co-founder of the primary enterprise? "Times are tough, Your Honor," Rosenthal said smoothly. "My client is practically starting over." Chloe looked over at Catherine, expecting to see the older woman finally break, to see the composure shatter into desperate, weeping outrage. Instead, Catherine simply turned her head, made direct eye contact with Chloe, and offered a chilling, microscopic smile. At that exact moment, Arthur Penhaligon stood up. Arthur Penhaligon did not look like a man staring down the barrel of a humiliating legal defeat. Tall, imposing, and possessing a voice that sounded like gravel grinding against velvet, Arthur commanded the courtroom the second he pushed his chair back. "Your Honor," Arthur began, his tone polite but laced with a dangerous edge. "We do not contest Mr. Rosenthal's brilliant work of fiction regarding the current state of the joint accounts. In fact, we are fully aware that Mr. Sterling has spent the last 36 months systematically defrauding the marital estate, funneling roughly $700 million into 3 separate holding companies headquartered in the Cayman Islands." "Objection!" Rosenthal shouted, leaping to his feet. "Outrageous slander. There is zero proof of these allegations, and opposing counsel is attempting to prejudice the court with baseless conspiracy theories." "Sustained," Judge Miller said, holding up a hand. "Mr. Penhaligon, unless you have a paper trail that miraculously pierces offshore corporate veils, which we both know takes years of international litigation, you will confine your arguments to the affidavits submitted." "I have no intention of piercing the corporate veil, Your Honor," Arthur said calmly, pacing slowly into the center aisle. He adjusted his cuffs, his eyes briefly flicking toward Richard, who suddenly looked nauseous. "Because I don't need to. The location of the funds is entirely irrelevant because Mr. Bruthing Sterling does not own them." Chloe frowned, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging slightly into her expensive purse. What did he mean? Richard didn't own them. Of course he did. She was the listed beneficiary on 2 of those shell companies. "Counselor, you are speaking in riddles," Judge Miller warned. "I apologize, Your Honor. Let me be unequivocally clear," Arthur said, reaching back to his table. Catherine silently handed him a single yellow document encased in a clear protective sleeve. "The defense moves to dismiss the standard asset division protocols entirely. We are not operating under the state's equitable distribution laws. We are operating under the parameters of the binding, notarized prenuptial addendum executed on October 14th, 8 years ago." David Rosenthal froze. He snapped his head toward Richard. "What addendum? You told me the original 1999 prenup was voided." "It was," Richard hissed, his face draining of all color. "I don't know what he's talking about." Your Honor, opposing counsel is ambushing us. Rosenthal scrambled, trying to regain his footing. No such document was provided in the initial discovery phases. It was submitted to the court clerk precisely 10 minutes before today's session began, well within the legal parameters for introducing superseding contractual agreements, Arthur replied, handing a copy to the bailiff who carried it up to the judge. Another copy was unceremoniously dropped onto Rosenthal's table. Chloe leaned over, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs, as Rosenthal frantically flipped through the pages. The legal jargon was dense, but even she could read the bolded headers. Postnuptial asset protection addendum. 8 years ago, Arthur's voice echoed through the deathly silent courtroom. Mr. Sterling engaged in a brief but highly publicized indiscretion with a golf instructor in Palm Beach. My client, Mrs. Sterling, was prepared to file for divorce then. To save his marriage and his public reputation, Mr. Sterling begged for reconciliation. Mrs. Sterling agreed, but only under one strict condition: the execution of a highly specific postnuptial contract. Richard's hands were shaking. The memory, buried under years of arrogance and unchecked ego, was violently resurfacing. He remembered the cold, rainy Tuesday he signed it. He had barely read it, so desperate was he to keep Catherine from walking out the door and collapsing Sterling Holdings' stock price. If we turn to page 4, section 7, clause B, Arthur instructed, watching Judge Miller's eyes scan the page. The absolute forfeiture clause. It outlines the specific financial penalties triggered by a verified breach of the morality statute. Your Honor, this is an archaic morality clause. Rosenthal protested, sweating profusely now. Courts rarely uphold them to the letter, especially regarding modern asset division. They are punitive and unenforceable. On the contrary, Mr. Rosenthal, Judge Miller said, his eyebrows rising as he read the text. This isn't vaguely written at all. It is explicitly detailed. It was drafted by a corporate contract specialist, not just a family lawyer. And it appears your client signed it in the presence of 3 witnesses and a federal notary. Chloe couldn't take the suspense anymore. Richard, she whispered harshly, her polished veneer cracking. Richard, what does it say? What did you sign? Richard couldn't look at her. He was staring at Arthur Penhaligon as if the lawyer were the Grim Reaper himself. For the benefit of the gallery, Arthur said, turning to face Richard directly, allow me to read the penalty for infidelity in the event that Richard Sterling engages in a romantic or sexual relationship outside the bounds of the marriage, and such infidelity is the primary catalyst for the dissolution of the union. Richard Sterling hereby forfeits his right to equitable distribution. Arthur paused, letting the words hang in the air like a guillotine blade. The clause continues, Arthur boomed. Upon undeniable proof of infidelity, 100% of all marital assets, including real estate, stock portfolios, domestic and international bank accounts, intellectual property and corporate holdings, regardless of whose name they currently reside under, shall instantly revert to the sole and exclusive ownership of Catherine Sterling. Duel. A collective gasp echoed off the high-vaulted ceilings of the courtroom. The reporters in the back row began scribbling furiously. Chloe felt all the air leave her lungs. 100%. You're lying, Chloe breathed out, the words slipping past her lips before she could stop them. Several heads turned toward her. He transferred the money. The LLCs are in my name. You can't touch them. Judge Miller slammed his gavel down. The gallery will remain silent or I will have the courtroom cleared. He glared at Chloe before turning his attention back to Richard's attorney. Mr. Rosenthal, control your client's guests. Arthur smiled, a cold, predatory expression. Ms. Hastings brings up a fascinating point regarding the LLCs, which leads me to Section 8 of the addendum, the fraudulent transfer protocol. Arthur walked slowly back to his table, resting his hands flat on the mahogany surface, leaning toward Richard and Chloe. Any asset, Arthur enunciated clearly, transferred out of the marital estate during the course of an extramarital affair to a third-party accomplice, is legally defined under this contract as theft from Catherine Sterling, and this contract grants my client the immediate right to file criminal grand larceny charges against the recipient of those stolen funds. Chloe's triumphant smirk was entirely gone, replaced by a pale, breathless mask of sheer terror. She hadn't just lost the billions. If this document held up, she was going to prison. The silence in courtroom 302 was no longer just tense. It was a physical weight pressing down on the chests of everyone present. David Rosenthal, a lawyer who had built a lucrative career on aggressive bluster and procedural bullying, was standing with his mouth slightly ajar, entirely stripped of his usual armor. He looked from the heavily notarized postnuptial addendum in his hands to his client, Richard Sterling, who was currently staring at the mahogany table as if staring hard enough might open a trapdoor beneath his Italian leather loafers. Grand larceny? Rosenthal finally choked out, the word sounding absurd even to his own ears. He turned back to Judge Miller, rallying his courtroom theatricality. Your Honor, this is a gross misinterpretation of contract law. A postnuptial agreement cannot supersede the state's penal code. Mrs. Sterling's counsel is attempting to weaponize a civil family court proceeding to issue criminal threats. Furthermore, the funds transferred to the Cayman LLCs were legitimate business investments authorized by my client in his capacity as CEO of Sterling Holdings. Investments? Arthur Penelligon countered, not raising his voice, yet somehow projecting to the very back rows of the gallery. Your Honor, we have traced the exact routing of these so-called investments. Over the course of the last 14 months, exactly $712 million was moved from the Sterling's joint wealth management accounts at Bessemer Trust. The money was wired through a labyrinth of shell companies before landing in 3 specific accounts managed by Apex Corporate Services in the Grand Cayman. Arthur picked up a secondary, thicker folder from his table. He didn't even look at it. He had the contents memorized. Those 3 LLCs, Arthur continued, are named Sunbird Equities, Horizon Ventures, and C.H. Holdings. C.H. Being the rather unimaginative initials of Miss Chloe Hastings. Miss Hastings is listed as the sole primary beneficiary and managing director of all 3 entities. These were not business investments, Mr. Putt. Rosenthal. They were a carefully orchestrated severance package funded entirely by my client's legally protected marital assets. Not Chloe's heart was beating so fast it felt like a trapped bird battering against her ribs. She looked at Richard, silently pleading for him to fix this, to deploy the ruthless business acumen she had so admired. But Richard remained frozen, his face a pale, sweating mask of defeat. "Richard," Chloe hissed, her voice trembling, stripping away the polished veneer of the dutiful, loving partner. "Tell the judge those were my consulting fees. Tell them I earned that equity." Judge Miller's gavel cracked like a gunshot. "Miss Hastings, I have warned you. One more outburst and the bailiff will escort you to a holding cell for contempt." The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression hardening as he turned to Rosenthal. "Counselor, your client's signature is on this addendum. The phrasing is airtight. It explicitly defines the unauthorized transfer of marital assets during an active period of infidelity as a hostile depletion of the estate, granting the injured spouse the right to seek criminal restitution. How do you intend to argue that an affair did not take place, thereby invalidating the trigger clause?" Rosenthal swallowed hard. He had nothing. For 6 months, he and Richard had operated under the assumption that Catherine was a blindsided, grieving housewife scrambling for table scraps. They hadn't bothered to hide the affair. They had paraded it. Chloe had been photographed on Richard's yacht in St. Hen. But They had dined publicly at Le Bernardin. They had attended the Met Gala together just 3 weeks prior. The infidelity wasn't a secret, it was a weapon they had actively used to humiliate Catherine into submission. "Your Honor," Rosenthal stammered, his mind racing for a loophole. "Even if the morality clause is triggered, proving the timeline of the financial transfers aligns perfectly with the, romantic entanglement to the strict standard required for a grand larceny accusation is an entirely different burden of proof." Arthur Penhaligon smiled. It was the smile of a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "I am so glad you brought up the timeline, David," Arthur said smoothly, stepping away from the podium and walking deliberately toward the defense table, "because the timeline is the most fascinating part of this entire tragedy. You see, Richard and Ms. Hastings believed they were operating in the shadows during the early days of their romance. They believed that by communicating via encrypted messaging apps and booking hotel suites under corporate aliases, they were invisible." Arthur stopped directly in front of Catherine. For the first time since the proceedings began, Catherine moved. She slowly unclasped her hands, reached into the breast pocket of her charcoal blazer, and withdrew a small, silver flash drive. She placed it perfectly in the center of the table. "My client," Arthur announced, his voice dropping an octave, "did not discover this affair 3 months ago when Mr. Sterling dramatically packed his bags. She discovered it 18 months ago, and rather than confront him, rather than file for divorce in a fit of passionate rage, she did what any brilliant CEO does when faced with an internal threat." Arthur paused for dramatic effect. "She hired Kroll." A murmur swept through the press corps. Kroll was the gold standard for corporate investigations, a global risk consulting firm known for employing former FBI and intelligence operatives. They didn't just find cheating spouses, they dismantled corporate espionage rings. Chloe felt all the blood drain from her face. 18 months? She and Richard had only been sleeping together for 18 months and 2 weeks. Kroll operatives, Arthur detailed, tapping the table next to the flash drive, monitored every dinner at Le Bernardin, every weekend getaway to Aspen, every encrypted message, and most importantly, every single keystroke Mr. Bunn Sterling made on his Bessemer Trust portal. "We have the exact timestamp of when the affair became physical. And we have the exact timestamps down to the second of when the first fraudulent wire transfer was initiated to Sunbird Equities." Arthur leaned heavily on his hand, staring directly into Richard's terrified eyes. "The money moved precisely 4 days after the first documented romantic encounter, which means every single dollar transferred to Ms. Hastings falls squarely under the jurisdiction of the fraudulent transfer protocol. The Lord. The lives." The courtroom felt as though it had been plunged into a vacuum. The sheer scale of Catherine's calculation was terrifying. She hadn't just been a victim of Richard's betrayal, she had been the silent architect of his complete financial ruin. She had watched him steal from her, smiled over morning coffee, and let him dig a grave so deep there was absolutely no chance of climbing out. "You set me up," Richard whispered, the words slipping out of him in a hoarse, broken breath. He finally turned to look at his wife. "Catherine, you let me do it. You let me transfer the money." Catherine Sterling slowly stood up. The judge did not stop her. Arthur stepped aside, allowing his client to command the floor. When Catherine spoke, her voice was not laced with anger or sorrow. It was perfectly, terrifyingly calm, carrying the cold authority of a judge handing down a life sentence. "I didn't set you up, Richard," Catherine said, her eyes locked onto his. "You made a choice. When we built Sterling Holdings together 25 years ago, we made a vow to protect the empire at all costs. 8 years ago, when you strayed the first time, I gave you mercy. I gave you the addendum as a boundary line. I told you explicitly that if you ever humiliated me again, you would leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, which was nothing." Richard shrank back in his chair, his shoulders collapsing. 18 months ago, Catherine continued, her gaze briefly flicking to Chloe, reducing the younger woman to an insignificant speck. I received a dossier from Kroll containing photographs of you and your assistant leaving a boutique hotel in Tribeca. I could have invoked the contract that very afternoon. I could have taken the company, the houses, and the accounts and left you penniless. Catherine placed her hands flat on the table, leaning slightly forward. But then I noticed something interesting. I noticed you were trying to hide the money. You thought I was too distracted by my philanthropic boards to notice the subtle restructuring of our domestic LLCs. You thought I wouldn't understand the sudden offshore liquidations. So you waited, Rosenthal said quietly, realizing the absolute genius of the trap. I waited, Catherine confirmed, her eyes never leaving Richard's. If I had divorced you then, you would have fought me for years in civil court over the valuation of the commercial properties. You would have tied up the empire in endless litigation. But by allowing you to systematically wire $700 million into Ms. Hastings' name while maintaining the affair, you handed me the legal mechanism to bypass civil asset division entirely. You triggered the criminal forfeiture clause. Chloe couldn't breathe. The walls of the courtroom felt like they were closing in. The penthouse on Central Park West, the society galas, the billion-dollar empire, it was all a mirage. Catherine had painted a fake tunnel onto a brick wall, and Chloe and Richard had run into it at top speed. Your Honor, Arthur Penhaligon interjected, bringing the focus back to the legal mechanics. Under the terms of the validated postnuptial agreement, Mr. Sterling has legally forfeited his 50% stake in Sterling Holdings, as well as his claim to all marital liquid assets. Furthermore, we are formally petitioning the court to freeze the Cayman accounts linked to Miss 2. Hastings, pending a criminal investigation by the District Attorney's Office for conspiracy to commit grand larceny. You can't do this, Chloe suddenly shrieked, shooting up from her chair, her carefully manicured composure entirely shattered. She pointed a shaking, diamond-clad finger at Richard. It was his idea. He told me the money was safe. He told me it was legally his to give. I didn't steal anything. He gave it to me. Richard's head snapped toward her, his survival instincts finally kicking in, overriding his midlife infatuation. Shut up, Chloe, he snapped, his voice cracking with panic. He turned wildly to Judge Miller. Your Honor, she knew exactly what we were doing. You set up the Cayman accounts herself. She had her brother draft the incorporation papers for C8 Holdings to bypass the domestic banking flags. Have the emails. The gallery erupted into chaotic whispers. The grand, sweeping romance that had splashed across the pages of page 6 was disintegrating in real time, devolving into a pathetic, vicious scramble for survival. They were throwing each other to the wolves before the judge had even ruled. Order, Judge Miller roared, slamming his gavel repeatedly until the room fell back into a stunned silence. He glared down at the petitioner's table, his expression one of profound disgust. Mr. Rosenthal, the judge said, his voice dripping with contempt. Given the introduction of this legally binding post-nuptial contract and the frankly staggering evidence of premeditated financial fraud presented by the respondent, I am denying your motion for equitable distribution. Rosenthal closed his eyes, rubbing his temples. It was over. It was the most catastrophic defeat of his career. Furthermore, Judge Miller continued, his pen scratching aggressively across the official docket, I am granting Mrs. Sterling's petition for immediate 100% executive control over Sterling Holdings and all associated domestic assets. I am also issuing an emergency injunction freezing the offshore accounts managed by Apex Corporate Services, and I will be forwarding the Crow dossier, along with the transcript of today's proceedings, directly to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for review of potential felony larceny and wire fraud charges against both Mr. Sterling and Miss Hastings. Chloe's knees gave out. She collapsed back into her chair, a hollow, strangled sob escaping her throat. She looked down at the 10-carat diamond ring on her finger. It no longer looked like a symbol of victory. It looked like the heavy, glittering padlock of a prison cell. Across the aisle, Catherine Sterling calmly picked up the Kroll flash drive, slid it back into her pocket, and buttoned her charcoal blazer. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply picked up her briefcase, the absolute master of her empire once again, and prepared to leave the ruins of her marriage behind. The sharp crack of Judge Miller's gavel did not just adjourn the proceedings, it effectively detonated a nuclear bomb in the center of Richard Sterling's life. As the bailiff barked for the gallery to rise, the suffocating silence of courtroom 302 shattered into a chaotic symphony of scraping chairs, frantic whispers, and the rapid-fire clicking of reporters' keyboards. David Rosenthal did not wait for the judge to leave the bench. The slick, high-powered defense attorney aggressively unclipped his gold fountain pen, shoved his legal pads into his leather briefcase, and snapped the brass locks shut with a sharp, furious sound. His face was a dark, mottled crimson. "David, wait!" Richard pleaded, his voice stripped of its usual baritone authority. He reached out to grab his lawyer's sleeve. "We can appeal this, right? The injunction, you can file an emergency motion with the appellate division to unfreeze the domestic accounts. I need access to liquidity to pay my retainer." Rosenthal violently yanked his arm away, glaring at the man who had just nuked his win-loss record. "Pay your retainer? Richard, you don't have a retainer. You don't have a checking account. You don't even have the lint in your pockets. As of 5 minutes ago, your wife legally owns it all." "You are my counsel," Richard hissed, glancing nervously at the lingering press corps who were practically climbing over the wooden partition to hear them. "I was your civil counsel for a standard equitable distribution divorce," Rosenthal corrected, his voice vibrating with barely contained rage. "You lied to me. You withheld a legally binding punitive postnuptial contract. You used my firm to inadvertently facilitate a prolonged cover-up of wire fraud and grand larceny. You have made me look incompetent in front of a Supreme Court judge. I am officially withdrawing as your attorney of record." Chloe, who'd been sitting paralyzed in her chair, suddenly snapped her head up. "You can't just leave us. What are we supposed to do?" "He said the Kroll files are going to the district attorney." Rosenthal looked down at Chloe with a mixture of pity and profound disgust. "Miss Hastings, the moment those files land on a desk at 1 Hogan Place, the Manhattan District Attorney's White-Collar Crime Division is going to initiate a grand jury probe. I suggest you find a very good criminal defense attorney, and I suggest you do it before your co-conspirator here decides to cut a plea deal and testify against you to save himself." With that, Rosenthal turned on his heel and stormed down the center aisle, pushing his way through the swarm of journalists. "Richard," Chloe gasped, the reality of the phrase white-collar crime division finally piercing through her shock. She stood up, her hands trembling so violently that her expensive clutch slipped from her grasp and hit the floor. "Richard, my brother. Oh God, my brother set up the C. H Holdings Incorporation papers. Is the registered agent in Delaware. If they investigate the LLCs, they're going to indict him too." Richard ran a hand over his face, leaving a smear of cold sweat across his forehead. His mind was racing, trying to calculate the damage, trying to find the backdoor exit he had always relied on. But there was no backdoor. Catherine had welded them all shut. "Call him," Richard ordered, his tone suddenly harsh and dictatorial. The loving, indulgent sugar daddy persona evaporated, replaced by a cornered animal. "Call your brother right now. Tell him to wipe the servers. Tell him to destroy the email chains regarding the Apex Corporate Services transfers." "Are you insane?" a voice rumbled from behind them. Richard and Chloe jumped. Arthur Penhaligon, Catherine's attorney, had paused at the edge of the petitioner's table. He was buttoning his bespoke suit jacket, looking entirely unbothered by the chaos around him. "If I may offer some free legal advice since you are currently unrepresented," Arthur said smoothly. Instructing a co-conspirator to destroy digital evidence while under an active emergency injunction is a federal offense. It carries a mandatory minimum sentence. Spoliation of evidence will only make the prosecution's job easier. Richard took a threatening step forward, his fists clenched. "You arrogant son of a Mr. Sterling," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "I highly recommend you do not finish that sentence. You are no longer a billionaire titan of industry. You are an unemployed, soon-to-be indicted squatter. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a press conference to give on the courthouse steps." Arthur walked away, leaving Richard and Chloe entirely alone in the emptying courtroom. Desperate, Chloe fumbled for her phone. She bypassed her encrypted messaging apps and dialed her brother Mark directly. The phone rang 3 times before going to voicemail. She dialed again, and again. On the 4th try, the line clicked open. "Mark!" Chloe cried out, tears finally spilling over her expertly applied mascara. "Mark, you have to listen to me. Everything went wrong. Catherine knew. She hired Kroll. They froze the Cayman accounts, and the judge is sending everything to the DA. Chloe, stop talking." Mark's voice was completely flat, devoid of any familial warmth. "Stop talking right now." "What?" "Mark, you need to help me find a lawyer. I said stop talking." Mark shouted, the panic evident in his voice. "I received a call from a federal investigator 45 minutes ago while you were in session. They served a subpoena to my firm. I've retained counsel. My lawyer has explicitly instructed me not to communicate with you. I am cooperating fully with the authorities to secure immunity." Chloe's breath hitched. The room began to spin. "Cooperating? Mark, I'm your sister." "Lat. Uncle, you dragged me into a $700 million wire fraud scheme." Mark fired back. "You told me the money was cleared by his corporate board." "You lied to me, Chloe. Don't ever call this number again." The mud were dead. The dial tone echoed in Chloe's ear, sounding exactly like a heart monitor flatlining. She slowly lowered the phone, looking at Richard. "He hung up on me," Chloe whispered. "He's turning state's evidence." Richard didn't comfort her. He didn't pull her into his arms and promise to protect her. Instead, he looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. He realized that in the eyes of the law, he and Chloe were no longer lovers. They were liabilities to each other. The race to the bottom had officially begun, and only one of them could cut a deal first. While Richard and Chloe were suffocating in the legal fallout downtown, Catherine Sterling was stepping out of a sleek black town car onto the sunlit pavement of Park Avenue. She stood at the base of the Sterling Holdings headquarters, a towering glass and steel monolith that she and Richard had conceptualized 2 decades ago. She didn't pause to admire the architecture. She had work to do. Flanked by Arthur Penhaligon and 2 private security contractors, Catherine walked through the revolving glass doors. The must-first marble lobby was buzzing with midday activity, but as Catherine strode toward the private executive elevators, a hushed silence fell over the reception desk. Rumors of the disastrous court hearing had already begun bleeding onto Wall Street message boards, but seeing Catherine here, flanked by muscle and lawyers, confirmed the bloodbath. Catherine swiped her platinum keycard, a card Richard had arrogantly assumed was deactivated months ago, and hit the button for the 52nd floor. When the elevator doors parted, the executive suite was in a state of pandemonium. Phones were ringing off the hook. Junior analysts were sprinting between glass-walled offices. The head of PR was shouting into a headset. But the moment Catherine stepped onto the plush carpet, the shouting stopped. She walked directly to the end of the hall, toward the double mahogany doors of the CEO's office. Richard's executive assistant, a nervous young man who had replaced Chloe 6 months ago, shot out from his desk. "Mrs. Sterling," he stammered, raising his hands. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Sterling gave strict orders that you are not allowed on this floor without an appointment. Mr. Sterling no longer works here," Catherine stated coldly, not even breaking her stride. She pushed past him, opening the double doors to the sprawling corner office that overlooked Central Park. It was a shrine to Richard's ego. Trophies from real estate galas, framed magazine covers featuring his face, and a massive, ridiculous portrait of himself hung behind the desk. "Gentlemen," Catherine said, turning to the two security contractors. "Box up his personal items, family photos, the golf clubs, the vanity awards. Everything else, the computers, the physical files, the safe belongs to the company. Leave it." As the guards moved in with cardboard boxes, Catherine turned to Arthur. "Convene the board of directors in the main conference room in exactly 10 minutes. I want Morgan Stanley and our primary underwriters dialed in via secure line." "Right away, Catherine," Arthur said, pulling out his phone. 10 minutes later, Catherine stood at the head of the massive obsidian conference table. 7 board members, mostly older men who had happily turned a blind eye to Richard's infidelity and questionable accounting as long as the stock price held, were staring at her with varying expressions of shock and terror. Catherine dropped a thick, leather-bound folder onto the table. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Catherine began, her voice projecting absolute authority. "I will make this brief. As of 1:30 p.m. today, pursuant to a legally binding arbitration order signed by the Supreme Court of New York, I am the sole 100% equity owner of Sterling Holdings. Richard Sterling has been permanently removed as Chief Executive Officer, and his shares have been forfeited to me. I am your new chairman and CEO." A wealthy venture capitalist at the far end of the table cleared his throat nervously. "Catherine, this is highly irregular. We have corporate bylaws. You can't simply stage a hostile takeover." "It is not a hostile takeover, Greg. It is asset reclamation." Catherine cut him off sharply. "And before any of you attempt to cite corporate bylaws, let me be very clear. I have Kroll's forensic accounting reports regarding the $700 million Richard siphoned offshore. I also have the names of the 3 board members who signed off on those transfers under the guise of international market research." The blood drained from the faces of 3 men sitting on the left side of the table. "The district attorney is currently reviewing those wire transfers for felony fraud," Catherine continued, pacing slowly behind her chair. "Anyone who resists my transition of power today will find themselves named as an unindicted co-conspirator in tomorrow morning's Wall Street Journal. Anyone who cooperates will keep their board seat and their dignity. Are we entirely clear?" The silence in the room was absolute. One by one, the board members nodded. "Excellent," Catherine said, taking her seat at the head of the table. "Now, let's get to work." Later that evening, Richard Sterling stood on the sidewalk outside his Central Park West penthouse. It was raining a cold, miserable New York drizzle. He pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner of the private elevator. The screen flashed red. ACCS denied. He tried his keycard. Invalid. Panicking, he pulled out his phone and checked his banking app. The balance on his personal platinum card, which usually hovered around a comfortable $2 million, read $0. Accountant 4 Rosen purse 1 to court, John. He had nothing. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the stomach. He leaned against the cold stone of the building, gasping for air. He pulled up Chloe's contact, his thumb hovering over the call button. He needed her to access the Cayman accounts. Even if they were legally frozen, she might know a way to wire a fraction of it to a shadow account so he could at least get a hotel room. Before he could press dial, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered it frantically. "Hello?" Mr. Sterling," a calm, clinical voice said. "My name is Jonathan Hayes. I am the lead forensic investigator for Kroll. I oversaw the audit of your offshore entities." Richard's blood ran cold. "What do you want?" "Haven't you people done enough?" "I'm calling out a professional courtesy, Mr. Sterling." "Thus, Mrs. Sterling requested I share one final piece of the Kroll dossier with you directly as it pertains to your immediate financial reality." "I know the Cayman accounts are frozen," Richard snapped. I was in the courtroom. Yes, the primary accounts at Apex Corporate Services are frozen, Jonathan replied smoothly. But I'm referring to the secondary transfers. The ones Miss Hastings made without your authorization. Richard froze. What secondary transfers? Over the past 6 months, while you were funneling money into C.H. Holdings, Ms. Hastings was quietly skimming off the top, Jonathan explained. The sound of paper rustling in the background. She authorized 42 separate wire transfers, totaling roughly $15 million, into a decentralized Binance cryptocurrency wallet. A wallet that is entirely untraceable, completely outside of our jurisdiction and registered exclusively to her. The phone slipped a fraction of an inch in Richard's sweaty grip. She was stealing from me? It appears so, Mr. Sterling, Jonathan said. While you were defrauding your wife to build a life with your mistress was defrauding you to build an escape hatch for herself. I thought you should know before you attempt to rely on her for financial assistance. Have a good evening. The line clicked dead. Richard stood in the freezing rain, the glittering lights of his former empire reflecting in the puddles at his feet. The ultimate predator of Manhattan real estate had been outplayed, outsmarted, and entirely stripped to the bone. He looked up at the darkened windows of the penthouse he no longer owned, the rain soaking through his ruined Armani suit, finally understanding the true cost of his betrayal. Chloe Hastings was not a woman accustomed to the jarring, aggressive pounding of a heavy fist against a solid oak door. For the past 3 years, her world had been defined by the soft chime of private elevators, the hushed whispers of Michelin-starred waitstaff, and the gentle quinking of crystal champagne foods. But at 6 o'clock on a grim Tuesday morning, the brutal reality of her situation came violently knocking at the door of her rented Tribeca loft. She had spent the last 48 hours in a state of hyperventilating panic, frantically trying to liquidate the $15 million she had skimmed into her untraceable Binance cryptocurrency wallet. She had planned to transfer the funds to an offshore exchange, pack a single Rimowa suitcase, and board a private charter to a non-extradition country. But when she logged into her digital wallet, a terrifying red banner had greeted her. ACC out and restorest. Pursuant to federal sub door. Jonathan Hayes and the Kroll forensic team had not just found the wallet. They had handed the digital ledger directly to the Cybercrimes Division. NYPD. Open the door! A voice boomed from the hallway, followed by another series of deafening knocks. Chloe backed away from the door, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her phone onto the hardwood floor. She caught a glimpse of herself in the gilded entryway mirror. The impeccably styled, confident mistress who had smirked in courtroom 302 was gone. Her hair was a tangled mess. Her designer silk pajamas were wrinkled and her eyes were wide with the primal terror of a trapped animal. Before she could even formulate a thought, the heavy wooden door was breached with a splintering crack. 4 plainclothes detectives swarmed into the loft, their badges flashing under the recessed lighting. Chloe Hastings, the lead detective, a towering man with a weathered face, asked sharply. He didn't wait for an answer. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit grand larceny, wire fraud, and money laundering. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. No way, please, Chloe sobbed, the cold steel of the handcuffs biting into her wrists. You don't understand. I was manipulated. Richard Sterling forced me to do it. I want to speak to the district attorney. You'll have plenty of time to talk to the DA, miss. Hastings, the detective replied dryly, guiding her roughly toward the shattered door. Your brother Mark already gave them a 6-hour proffer session. He handed over every encrypted email you ever sent him. Watch your step. As Chloe was led out of the luxury building in handcuffs, her face entirely exposed to the flashing cameras of the paparazzi, tipped off by the police scanner, Richard Sterling was already sitting in a windowless, fluorescent-lit interrogation room at 1 Hogan Place. Richard looked as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of days. He was wearing the same Armani suit he had worn to court, though it was now hopelessly wrinkled and smelled of stale sweat and cheap coffee. Across the metal table sat Assistant District Attorney Rachel Montgomery, a notoriously ruthless prosecutor who had built her career dismantling white-collar criminals. Next to Richard sat a deeply exhausted public defender, the only legal counsel he could secure after his assets were permanently frozen. "The plea deal is simple, Mr. Sterling," Ada Montgomery said, tossing a thick-bound Kroll dossier onto the table. It was the same dossier Catherine had weaponized in civil court, now transformed into a criminal indictment. "You plead guilty to 2 counts of felony wire fraud and 1 count of corporate embezzlement. We will recommend a sentence of 8 to 12 years at an upstate correctional facility rather than the federal maximum of 20. 8 years? Richard choked out, his chest tightening. "I am 52 years old. You are asking me to sign away a decade of my life. I was the CEO of Sterling Holdings. I built that company from the ground up." "No, Mr. Sterling," Montgomery corrected, her gaze completely devoid of sympathy. "Catherine Sterling built that company. You just happened to be standing next to her while she did it. And then you decided to steal $700 million from her. We have the bank records. We have the internal Kroll audit. And as of this morning, we have the full cooperation of your accomplice, Chloe Hastings, who is currently crying in a holding cell downstairs, desperately trying to throw you under the bus to save herself." Richard buried his face in his hands, a hollow, agonizing groan escaping his lips. He thought of the young, beautiful woman he had thrown away his entire life for. He had believed she was his ultimate prize, the glittering reward for his success. Instead, she had been a parasite, skimming his stolen money while he dismantled his own empire. He had traded a brilliant, fiercely loyal wife for a mirage, and now he was going to pay for it behind bars. Meanwhile, miles away from the grime of the criminal justice system, the atmosphere at the Pierre Hotel's grand ballroom was electric. Catherine Sterling stood at the center of the room, looking absolutely radiant in a custom-tailored emerald green evening gown. The event was a high society charity gala, heavily attended by the titans of Manhattan real estate. For weeks the industry had whispered about the Sterling scandal, expecting Catherine to retreat into humiliating obscurity. Instead, she had emerged as the undisputed queen of the board. She was currently deep in conversation with Stephen Ross, the billionaire chairman of the related companies, a real-life titan of the industry, who was now looking at Catherine not as a +1, but as an equal, formidable rival. "I have to admit, Catherine," Ross chuckled, swirling his scotch, "the way you handled the corporate restructuring was nothing short of surgical. The street is terrified of you. I hear you're breaking ground on the new Hudson Yards expansion next month?" "I am," Catherine smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that hadn't graced her face in years. "Sterling Holdings is trimming the fat and focusing on the future. We don't have time for bad investments anymore." A prominent society journalist, clutching a recorder, cautiously approached the circle. "Mrs. Sterling, if I could ask just one question. With the recent news of your ex-husband's federal indictment and his former assistant's arrest this morning, do you have any final words on the scandal that captivated the city?" Catherine paused. She took a slow sip of her champagne, her silver-flecked hair catching the light of the crystal chandeliers above. She looked around the ballroom, at the empire she had protected, at the legacy she had secured. "Just one," Catherine said, her voice carrying the calm, absolute authority of a woman who had won the ultimate war. "Always read the fine print. The spectacular downfall of Richard Sterling and Chloe Hastings serves as a chilling reminder that arrogance is often the loudest precursor to ruin. They believed they could outsmart the system, rewrite the rules of loyalty, and steal an empire in the shadows. But they tragically underestimated the quiet, calculating brilliance of a woman who refused to be a victim. Catherine Sterling didn't just survive the ultimate betrayal. She orchestrated a flawless legal checkmate proving that hell hath no fury like a brilliant woman with a Kroll forensic audit and an airtight prenuptial agreement. What did you think of Catherine's mastermind revenge? Did Richard and Chloe get the justice they deserved, or was the trap too harsh? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love this story of high-stakes drama and ultimate karma, hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, real-life tales of revenge, betrayal, and justice.